Welcome to the InnoFrontier podcast. I'm Jeff, and I'm so excited today to be here with Cahlan Sharp. Definitely one of the most influential entrepreneurs in the tech scene here in Utah for a few reasons. One, he's been a part of a few early stage companies that have had a lot of success. He's worked for some of the larger companies in Utah, like the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. But I think that one of the things that I've always appreciated is him starting DevMountain, which was a huge dev school out here. And I believe it probably was the biggest dev school in probably the States, is probably my guess.
It wasn't the biggest. It was one of the earliest,
really?
and regionally a really big. It was not the biggest though.
Where I'd really
great question. Like I would assume a lot of people would say, I've always had an interest in technology. I don't know that it took me a long time to realize that technology could be a part of my future. You know, going to school, going to college. When I was younger, it was always, you know, an interesting thing. It was always something I enjoyed doing. I remember building first versions of websites when I was in junior high with a friend of mine that had access to the internet, and we were just tinkering around with HTML and stuff like that. But at that point, I don't think anybody considered the internet a place where you went to do actually serious stuff. And even computers and technology, you know, at that level wasn't clear to me that there was a career path that was sustainable or that was something that I would be good at. It really took until I was probably a sophomore or so in college, when I finally realized, I sort of had this epiphany where it didn't really matter what I was going to do so much as it mattered that I cared a lot about what I was doing, or at least I needed to have a drive, a passion, a proclivity for it, so that I wouldn't just burn out. And that came in the form of, you know, I was in pre-dentistry at the time. I thought I was going to be a dentist and was shadowing a dentist in his office doing a procedure, and I just sat there and I was bored to tears. I was just like, I cannot see myself doing this day in and day out for the next 30, 40 years of my life. I could not put those two together. And so at the same time, thankfully, I was working for BYU Independent Study, which creates online high school, you know, courses for students all over the world. And I sort of was right up front with web, you know, right front row seat with web technology, and it was just fascinating to me. The whole thing was fascinating. And so even though, you know, dentistry was sort of a proven career path, I knew exactly what I'd be doing in 20 or 30 years. That you know, certainty wasn't actually a positive for me. It was a negative. And so with web technology and you know, technology in general, it was less clear what the path was, but also way more exciting, way more engaging, something that held my interest, something I frankly would do for free. You know, it was something that I was really excited about. So I've since learned that it's a huge advantage to be doing something that you would do for free and get paid to do it. And it doesn't always work like that. A lot of people work in industries and jobs that they wouldn't do for free. I'm not saying that, you know, you should work for free, but it's just that being able to combine that passion and a career path is a huge blessing for me, and not something that everybody gets to enjoy. There's challenges that come with that too, like being able to set boundaries with your work and not let it rule your life, those sorts of things. But overall, yeah, really fortunate to have figured that out somewhat early on.
And you took the approach of combining technology and entrepreneurship kind of early in your career. Could you walk us through kind of your first, maybe even couple jobs, but then your first startup that you started?
Yeah, and I've told this story in other places, as you know, it was an accidental thing. I was not at all, you know, when I started down the path of technology, or even in general in my life, I did not consider myself an entrepreneur. I did not, you know, kind of look at that path as something that I really wanted to invest time or energy in. I wanted stability. I wanted predictability. I wanted, you know, my wife, especially, it's like, we're going to have kids and a family. Where are we going to be living? And what's our standard of living going to be? And there's all these questions that are really important as a young married couple and as a young family. And, you know, going into technology put a lot of question marks behind those questions. And so trying to eliminate as much as possible, those question marks was important. So I went to work for some larger companies, larger organizations, and it felt a little bit more stable, felt a little more predictable. And the first experience I had with entrepreneurship was forced upon me a little bit, in the sense that I went to a job that I thought was sort of the next step in my career. I thought it was a good step up in compensation, so on and so forth. But come to find out, it was a contract position. I didn't even know what a contract position was at the time. The recruiter that I was working with sort of misled me on what the job actually was. I thought there were benefits and health insurance associated with it. There were none. It was just pure contract work. And having found myself in that situation, and our family suddenly, my wife was pregnant at the time, and it was like, what are we going to do?
Oh,
We just lost our health insurance. We finally came to the conclusion that if we're going to be contractors, like if we're not tethered to any company as a W-2 employee, let's be the best contractors we can be. Let's get some more people. Let's create more contracts. Let's see if we can sort of make the best out of what was to us a bad situation. And so we created our first startup that way, which was just a consulting company with me and a friend of mine, and we grew to about, I think, 12 employees at its height, and learned a lot of lessons. And actually from there was when I really discovered my love for entrepreneurship, because it's like once you've tasted the Kool-Aid, so to speak, of being able to be your own boss and have the freedom to pursue whatever path you want to pursue, and to be accountable to yourself, that was like a drug to me. It was really exciting and really liberating, and kind of, even though I went to work for some companies after that, I always have gravitated towards early stage companies, being in those highly exciting free environments.
yeah, and to that, some of the early companies you started with. So tell me a little bit about Undrip and K-12, a few of these other small looks like earlier stage companies, and what had led you to those ones.
Yeah, I jumped around a little bit. I worked for K-12, which is actually a large online school solution. So K-12 is a public company, multi-billion-dollar company that services online students all over the country. And I got to work on a small sort of research and development team that was exploring different opportunities in the business. It was sort of one of my last stints at a really large company, because pretty quickly it became clear that the research and the development we were doing was not going to lead down the path that we thought. And at the same time, I had a friend who had just, was living in San Francisco, had just raised seed funding for a social media startup called Undrip. And so I joined on with him there, and got to live a really exciting, fun, almost a dream of a time in San Francisco in the Bay Area, trying to get a startup off the ground. It was a blast. It was everything that I hoped it would be, working in the Bay Area and working with really talented people, really amazing engineers, really smart, good people. Um, my wife loved living in the Bay Area. It was extremely expensive, and ultimately the startup didn't work out the way we had hoped, and we ended up having to make a change there. But it was, I look at that as, maybe how a doctor would look at residency or something like that. In terms of entrepreneurship and tech companies, it was like getting a, residency or a PhD or something in startups. It was a fantastic educational experience. And I look at that as a very formative, like really important step in my career. Even though the business didn't ultimately work out, everything that's come from that has been, clearly due to some of the experiences that I had there.
I think whenever most people think of startups, I know I definitely do, you want to think to the small Silicon Valley startup with a really crappy office, everybody working super long hours, staying at the office, like that. I mean, there is something kind of romantic about like that, and I'm think having that experience has got to be so powerful. I never really like went out and did that. I kind of did it from here, which you can kind of do nowadays. It's a little different, but there's something about being in San Francisco. I totally agree. It's just like, it's magic.
Yeah, there's an
Um,
energy and a density over there that is unlike anything I've ever seen anywhere else. I mean, Utah's a fantastic place, and I've lived in Utah ever since, basically. But yeah, it is a wonderful place, and I hope it continues to be kind of a beacon and a hub of innovation and brilliance and all of those things. One of the companies that I was a part of, a few years ago, went to Y Combinator back in the Bay Area, and that was such a fun time to be back in the middle of that center of gravity for tech and startups and things like that. It was a lot of fun.
Oh, that's awesome. So did you get introduced to Scan while you were out in San Francisco, or was it when you came back here? Is that when you got introduced to Kirk and the team?
Yeah, I had known Kirk for some time before that, but not very closely. I met Kirk as we were out in San Francisco. They had an office there at the time, and they were right at the time that Undrip was trying to figure out what was going on, and the company wasn't going where we thought it was going to go, for all of us. I was connecting more with Kirk and finding out what they were doing, and they were moving back to Utah, hiring a couple of folks, and Kirk and I got to talking, and so I came on as a product engineer, product manager sort of role at Scan during an interesting transition for them. So that lasted. That was a short stint there. Made some great friendships and people that I love and look up to. Kirk is one of the smartest people I still have ever met or worked with. But around that time was when I started teaching part-time classes at DevMountain. In fact, in moving back to Utah was when I had one of these moments where, I'd been through enough companies and enough startups. It was sort of like, okay, what should I work on that's really going to make a dent in the universe and help people? I was having one of those like, what does it all mean moments, where I wanted the work that I did, I wanted it to matter to people. I wanted it to make a difference for people. And coming off of a failed social media startup, it definitely was something that was high on my priority list. And so teaching part-time classes for starting DevMountain teaching part-time classes was initially meant to be a side gig that just sort of scratched that itch of how do I really make impact and add meaning. But almost very accidentally and very quickly realized, oh, this is much bigger than I gave it credit for. This isn't just like part-time classes. People are interested. There's a huge need, and there's a huge market for this. And within a year, I had basically had to choose either I needed to stay at Scan or I needed to dedicate full time to DevMountain, and I chose the latter, obviously.
Wow. So when you started teaching classes, how did you advertise? So, for those listening, right, who don't know who DevMountain is, it was an in-person uh, dev school. You would go there and you'd learn different dev skills. They eventually got into different things, including like QA and product management and some other things. But at its core was teaching you either front end or back end development. Yeah. So how did you like advertise? Did you just tell your friends and say, "Hey, I'm going to be teaching classes in Provo," and how did that happen?
Yeah, I mean, and another kind of quick background there. At the time, the concept of a dev boot camp had just started to become a thing. There was one in Chicago, there was another one in the Bay Area, and so it was starting to become a thing. And I thought, wow, this is something I would love to do, and it was something that I wished existed when I was learning. Again, back to my career path, I didn't do a CS degree. I was already too far along in my 4-year degree to start all over with a CS program, and so I learned as much as I could in sort of taking off the shelf classes in school, but then I also was probably mostly self-taught. And so, this kind of program would have been perfect for me back in the day. And that was one of my sort of impetus for jumping into it. But yeah, in terms of advertising, I was fortunate enough to have taught at UVU and to have made enough connection that I was able to just get the word out by word of mouth and emailing old students and things and saying, hey, I'm thinking about doing this. Is this something you'd be interested in? Is this something that people that would be interested in? And was able to get, I think that initial cohort had just about 20 students in it. And which is again remarkable because it was a part-time class, so people were coming after hours, they're coming after work hours, and they were paying, I think it was like less than $3,000 to
Oh,
learn how to
wow.
code in 12 weeks. And it was like, I mean, it was amazing to me that enough people were convinced this was a good idea to do that. At the time, now that's extremely cheap, but
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
at the time it was like, wow, this is a lot of money people are paying, and it was. Uh, and so, yeah, it was like getting the word out initially was easier than I thought, and it actually attracted some really fascinating individuals. I mean, our first cohort had some just rock stars in it, and I've actually thought to myself multiple times it would be so cool to go back and do like a retrospective because it's been 10 years since that first cohort, and some of these people have gone on to do amazing things. And so anyway, it's fun to look back and realize how great those initial students were. But it was really that initial momentum and the people that were coming in the door, and very quickly we had more people asking to do the class than we had space to do it. And so then it became a matter of, okay, do we do we add more people? Do we add more instructors? Do we grow our space? That was a constant balance at DevMountain, was trying to keep the right applicants, not over promise to somebody that we could get them to where they needed to be without more background or education, but also growing to the need, growing to match the market demand.
Yeah, and to that point on that retrospective, because you've had some great entrepreneurs come through there. I think the founders of Podium went through DevMountain, which is really cool. A really good friend of mine, Daniel Falabella, went through, and even though he went kind of the product direction, now he's kind of back in the entrepreneurship thing. I always think it was interesting for the different people that would go through DevMountain. We were kind of talking a little bit before, but we have a few employees that went to DevMountain. So some have stayed truly in the development, some have gone product, some have gone the entrepreneurship route. So it'd be so interesting to kind of see what did happen from it. Certainly a lot of good. And when you were teaching, and then did you bring on partners? Did you how did you strive to like expand the company? And then I know that you guys kind of went to other states as well. It'd be interesting to hear a little bit about the scaling of it.
Yeah, it was in terms of partners, I found a couple of really great partners early on, Cole Henry and Tyler Richards, both good friends of mine. But at the time, I didn't know them at all. In fact, it was sort of somewhat of a unique circumstance in which we met, but it was sort of like we were all put in the same room together and say, like, how do we make this work? And we were able to find a working relationship that complemented our three personalities really well. We were able to, figure out how to get this initial location off the ground, and very soon a Salt Lake location. It was always a challenge at DevMountain to figure out how fast we could responsibly scale. And with education especially, it's a very tricky line to balance, because education is not like a transaction. It's not like you set up a storefront and people come and they bring money and you give them goods and they pay for the goods and the transaction's over, everybody's happy, you get a 5-star review. It's not like that. It requires investment from both sides, the teacher and the student. It requires good setup and curriculum and good space and lots of other things. And so it was very difficult to just stand up a new location. We created this another part-time course in Salt Lake City. It was way harder than we thought it would to stand up another location, even though Salt Lake City, it's a 25-minute drive from Provo. And so we learned a lot going through that first expansion, but we also, again, continued to be met with more demand than we had capacity. And so, again, it was like always this question of how much more do we add? How much more locations? Arizona was asking us to come. We knew there's opportunities in other places to go. So at our height, we were in Arizona, Texas, Salt Lake City, and Provo. We had 4 different locations, and each were unique. But the challenge still remained: how do we keep high quality instructors? How do we keep high quality applicants coming through? How much further can we grow and scale? We ended up trying locations in places like Minneapolis and other places with varying degrees of success. But that fundamental scaling problem was always a tricky one to solve.
And then, at some point you got to a place where selling the company made sense. I know that there was an acquisition there, and this is kind of, I'd love to hear more about your story. We actually just sold our first company this week. So the company that Peter and I had started before Quality all got wrapped up this week. And, thank you. And, it's always an interesting thing selling a company, the motivations, the timing. What was it that kind of made you think like, hey, I think that now's the time to be passing the baton to a new company?
Wow, there's a lot to explore there. Yeah. I think generally, and I'll speak more to Utah culture, but I think this applies to more places than Utah. I think a lot of people look at an exit or an acquisition and they think, oh wow, that's so great. You must have done super well, or they sort of have this picture in their heads of what that must look like. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that selling a company in most situations is an extremely stressful and traumatic, and sometimes traumatic experience. And I don't want to make that sound too over the top. I mean, people go through a lot harder things than selling their company for sure. But from a psychological, emotional, every other perspective, even physical perspective, it's a very, very challenging process. And for us, it was no different. At DevMountain, we had an acquirer come through the door, a potential partner. We liked them, they liked us. But very quickly in that relationship, you end up in a position where you are kind of, there's more and more riding on that acquisition, right? And you're trying to do the impossible job of running a business, a startup, a growing business that requires already all of your attention and time. But at the same time, you have another job, which is talking to the acquirer, going through due diligence, producing documents, getting on calls with lawyers constantly. And it felt like I was gonna, it felt like I was gonna explode. There was just so much going on. And so it was like I was continually adding more to the stack, where it was like, if this doesn't go through, I'm gonna be a wreck, because lots of acquisitions don't go through for any number of reasons. It could be that the acquirer woke up the morning of closing and said, hey, we don't want to do this deal anymore. Or maybe they don't like something about your business, or maybe something about their business changed and they don't anymore have the resources to make it happen. I feel extremely lucky that everything went as well as it possibly could have in our case, but I've heard lots of horror stories about exits or acquisitions that maybe look good on paper, but were actually not really good for most of the people involved. And so, um, anyway, I just say that because I think sometimes people hear acquired or exit and they immediately think like, oh, everything must have gone perfectly for you. The night I tell this often, but the night that we closed, right after the closing, my wife and I went to dinner, and I like almost had an anxiety attack in the restaurant where we were. I had to get out and walk laps around the restaurant because I had been holding and storing so much stress and anxiety, and just my body was so in fight or flight mode for so long that it was like I didn't know how to handle the future. Now it was suddenly like it could all be released, it was over, but my body didn't know how to deal with it. It was a strange experience, and not something you'd maybe expect on the night of closing, when something like a financial event happens like that. But anyway, the I say that to sort of like put a background behind a process that was extremely challenging, both for me, my co-founders, and our family. It was, something that just was really hard. And that's not to mention, once you go down that path of selling your business, it's like saying goodbye to a child, right? Like, we built DevMountain from the ground up. We worked with these incredible employees. We have all these wonderful memories of students. At one point, I thought I was going to be doing DevMountain for the rest of my life. It felt like my life's mission. I loved teaching the classes. I loved working with these students. And then fast forward a few years, and with the acquire and the way things had changed, I didn't really enjoy it anymore after everything was over, and so I ended up leaving, which I never thought I would do. So anyway, it was an amazing experience, an event in our lives, but also something that comes with a lot of good and a lot of hard things at the same time. Um, for us, I think if you take a step back and just look at the acquisition from like a startup perspective, we had a valuable business that wasn't just valuable to us, but it was valuable to the acquirer for a strategic reason. And you can't always predict that. Sometimes people will talk to me, or they ask me like sort of, they want to reverse engineer it. Like, how did you get acquired? And what are the steps that led to that? And how do we do the same thing? And it's really hard because it totally depends on your business, the industry, who the other people are in the space, what are the adjacent players, and what are their goals, and what are their strategies, and how do you fit into that. We just happen to fit into our acquirer's vision in a unique way that helped position them for something they wanted to do, and we were very fortunate for that to work out.
Well, I understand what you're saying. I feel like it's going to take me quite a long time to process the acquisition that we just had, mainly because we're doing quality. So I'm already in my second startup that overlapped with my first, you know, and me and my brother and Peter, the ones that had kind of really started Seva, we went out to lunch today, and all we did the whole time was talk about quality. So when you say that kind of unwinding, it's like, oh, I haven't even thought about that process. So yeah,
Yeah. Well,
it'll be
and
deferred,
it's different for everybody. Clearly,
of
some people
course.
go through it, and it's not as big of a deal. For us, it was a huge deal, and there was a lot of sleepless nights and stress and anxiety. But yeah, and frankly, some people handle that better than others too. Some people are very, very good at handling stuff like that, and staying resilient. I believe that mental health is a much bigger challenge than a lot of people give it credit for. I know it is for me, and so it's something that is important to keep your pulse on, and know your limits, or at least discover those limits and then respect them.
The two people that I know that like the two types of people I know that work all the time are developers and entrepreneurs. So it must be kind of a curse to be both. Can you, with kind of your subsequent activities, how have you, I don't know, what would have been some of those safeguards? You brought up some safeguards, that you can share that you've tried to
Yeah,
implement. And I know everybody's different, of course, but for you, what's
yeah.
been successful?
Great way to frame it because obviously each person is different. For me, it's been important to set boundaries with my work. That was what I mentioned earlier on with, some of the negative things that come along with finding your passion and making that your career is that when you would do it for free, it means that you would do it all night if you could, right? And there were plenty of nights where I pulled all-nighters or stayed up late or, worked extra hours to get something out the door, and I loved it. And that is a problem sometimes because when you love it so much, it's very easy to stay in it and not disconnect from it. Um, Thankfully, I have a family. I have a wife who's extremely supportive, but also cares more about me and my health than she does about the health of my startup. And so she's a wonderful, important sounding board and counterbalance to what's happening at work, and she understands that there are times where fires are burning and I can't just clock out at 5 and be done. But she also understands that sometimes where she can say, hey, look, is this something you really need to be doing tonight, or can you take a break? And thankfully, I think we've worked long enough together in our relationship and in our marriage that I have a pretty good sense for when I can put things to the side and when I need to push on something and not let it go. It's still a conversation. It's still something we're both working through, but there have definitely been moments in our marriage where we've had to gut check ourselves and say like, okay, are we really ready to do this? I was going to ask you, I don't know if you're married, but how does your wife feel about you jumping so quickly into another startup?
Well, we started our first company pretty much while I was in college. So it's
Okay,
kind of always just been a part of our lives. I've always just been involved in a startup at some level. So I think that there's just some natural conditioning that's
great.
there. I think that the advantage to this one was that we had kind of built quality on the back of Seva. So really, it's been the same thing. It's almost been like
Okay,
one continuum. Um,
great.
so yeah, I mean, so we've been married, for almost 10 years. And of those 10 years, I've had a startup the whole time, I think. So
That's great.
that's been, yeah. So I think that it's just
Well,
been good.
and I was going to say that's another thing too, where you also have to learn your spouse's boundaries and what they value. And frankly, some of us, meaning the breadwinners or the people in the startup, some of us are better at doing that and handling the stress and things go along with that. And some people are better at being partners of those people than others, right? I know some people who could never handle the uncertainty of being married to a startup or married to somebody who's a founder, and that's no knock on them. It's just different personalities and different thresholds and things like that. um, my wife, we've had to have a couple of conversations over the years where, like, for example, when I left Scan to do DevMountain, that was a really hard thing for her because at the time, we had just been married for 10 years. We had just bought our first home, like first actual real home in Utah,
Oh,
and it was like in her mind, it was like I was walking away from stability and a good, salary and all these things to throw caution to the wind and put everything at risk again. And so, it took some thought and pondering and prayer and discussions on both of our sides to say like, okay, is this really what we want to do right now? And there's been times where she's actually pushed me or encouraged me to get into something, and there's been times where I'm sort of pulling her along. And so for us, it's been really important to just have those conversations along the way constantly.
oh yeah, no, I definitely agree. I think that it has been really helpful for me to have that other person to, I don't know, give me an extra perspective, on life. Like I think that it's nice to have more of a life than just my startup, because then I feel like my startup experience can kind of enrich the other parts of my life, but then the other parts of my life can enrich my startup. Um, I mean, I've talked to a lot of people who can just do the startup singularly and that's all they do and that's their main focus and they can be wildly successful, but just everybody's different. And so for me, it's just nice to, to have other parts of my life. But, in so many ways, my family is also a startup. So the principles I'm learning actually kind of help in both ways, and just dealing with ambiguity and risk that comes into, like the same sort of ambiguity and risk comes in marriage as it does with a startup or with a business partner. And so, you can evaluate those things similarly, not the exact same, but similarly.
Yeah.
Um, And
Well,
sadly, I wish that I could say I figured it out, but I haven't.
well, I don't know that it is figure outable in like the same period of time that maybe product market fit is for a given startup. But like, yeah, I'm 100% in agreement. And I think that one mistake that we make, and I say we as in like culturally, Utah and beyond, we often tie our identities to our startups, right? And we tie, whether consciously or otherwise, we start tying like our self-worth, our identity, our persona into what we do as workers or as founders. And sometimes you see that happen. I sometimes get a little bit overly annoyed when the first question that somebody asks when they meet you is, what do you do? What do you do? What do you do? What's your company? And I think that's innocent. There's totally fine to understand what people do, and it's very interesting to find out what people do. But that's not who they are, right? People aren't they are not their startups. They are much more than that. They're individuals. They're people with talents and capabilities and unique personalities and strengths and weaknesses. And we have so much to learn from each other outside of what we do in our startups or what companies we founded. And so and you have to be careful, because if you tie your identity and your value and your worth to your startup, and if that startup fails, you feel like a failure and you feel like you failed as a human being and as a person. And one of the lessons that can come from entrepreneurship and startups is that failure is not necessarily a negative thing. Like, you've got to be able to like move on. You've got to be able to like roll with the punches and fail upwards, or whatever the right cliche is. But I've seen some really negative things happen. Individuals that put a ton of their personal stock into the company.
That's really valuable. Actually, I just heard somebody say this, and I thought to myself, oh my gosh, that's exactly what I do. I am so guilty of that, because I feel like, yeah, if something bad happens, it's a complete personal reflection on me, and I have no idea how to solve that problem. And it was weird. There was like this rationality of me that's saying like, well, to some extent, maybe it's helpful because it's motivating, but it's really not. It's not helpful at all. And so it is good to separate those. At some point, I want to hear your thoughts on that, because that would be, just on a personal level. So you stayed with the company for a little bit, and then you started to move into Prenda. How was, what was that, what was that story, of going and then working for that organization?
Yeah, so one of the things that we constantly were, assessing and evaluating at DevMountain was just the applicants coming through the door. It took not just anybody, but it took somebody who had a drive and a passion and a work ethic and a mindset to be able to learn in this environment. We used to tell students all the time that this is not like regular school, in the sense that you can sit in the back of the room, complete your assignments at the last minute, procrastinate, and then walk out with a piece of paper. This is not that experience, and you have to invest heavily in your educational experience if you're going to be successful. And one of the things we found is that just the school system, I should say, the educational system in general, set us up for failure in some ways. It's taught us that credentialism is everything. If you have the degree, you've got the ticket. If you've sat through the classes, you've got the skills. And that's not necessarily the case. Very, very clear to us at DevMountain. And one of the things that I used to ask myself is like, man, what if we could go younger? What if we could go to kids and say, hey, here's how you should be thinking about solving problems. Here's how you should be thinking about your education. Not just like what's being forced down your throat, but like, what are you interested in? What are you passionate about? How do you learn something without somebody being there in front of you telling you what to do every step of the way? And so I found a co-conspirator, in some of these ideas and philosophies in Kelly Smith, the founder of Prenda. And he and I met when we were exploring opportunities for expansion in Arizona with DevMountain, and we just immediately connected on a lot of things on a philosophical level, and how we felt about education, how we felt about kids, how we felt about, the way that they were being taught. And he was ready to jump in and start his own micro school. He wanted to experiment and try to teach kids in a totally different way, in a totally different format, and did it with what we decided was great success. And so then it was, okay, can we try to make this a scalable thing? Can we help empower other people to start micro schools and create these alternative forms of education? And it went really well. We found a ton of obstacles, and it was a very like most businesses, it was very challenging in its own way. But it was a blast, and I still have wonderful lifelong relationships with the people that I worked with over there. It was a fantastic company.
And then where did School AI come into play? Again, kind of another K through 12, type organization. Talk to me a little bit about how that came into the picture and why that was so appealing at that time.
Yeah, the impetus was I had an old friend and colleague that used to work with me at DevMountain. He then went and worked for Apple for a while, building some technology and training pieces over there. And then he went and helped co-found Lambda School, which became a very,
Oh,
uh,
yeah, of
one
course.
one of the most popular, boot camps around, all online. And he and I always stayed friends, always would catch up with each other. And at one point, he had left Lambda School. He was starting a new venture, and I was always supportive, always kind of an extra voice, just whether it was just being a sounding board or offering help or collaborating in some way. But when ChatGPT came out a year ago, a little over a year ago, it was clear that like everything was going to change, at least from our perspective. Education was going to be profoundly impacted by the coming wave of AI and large language models. And so he started to think very deeply about what that meant and what that could mean for schools. And I got really excited about that as well. And frankly, at the time, didn't really think I was going to do another startup. I felt a little bit like I would imagine professional athletes feel after like a 10 to 15 year stint in a sport, where it's like you feel like your body is not the same as it used to be. I didn't have the energy to pull the all-nighters anymore, and I didn't know that I would ever do another startup. But seeing the convergence of education and AI coming, I just couldn't help but be a part of it. And so he and I joined forces early this year and started building, prototypes and proof of concepts for how teachers could use AI in education to make their lives easier. Our public school teachers are some of the most overworked and underpaid, under-resourced people out there. Replace them or threaten them or something. We thought, what if we could build something that empowered them and help leverage their capabilities and help them to be superhumans, right? And so that served us really well in building the early stuff at School AI, and still discovering new interesting things all the time.
Well, I mean, I'm really excited about it. I think that, for my kids, I want them to be utilizing AI as much as they can as a student to help empower them to do great things, and I hope that their teachers are doing the same thing. And that's why I'm super excited about what you're doing. I think you've already hinted at this, but the traditional K through 12 system, I think, just conditions you to potentially the wrong things. The credentialing as opposed to the capability. And that's where I think AI unlocks. It unlocks that ability to be more capable, and to utilize your time better. So, really excited as you look into the future. With all the exciting things that have been happening, where's K through 12 going? I mean, you don't have to like give like your prediction, but what are some of the things that you're looking at over the next few years? I say this as an interested father as well, but just like, where's K through 12 going in your opinion?
I think at least in the realm of technology and AI, I mean, anybody who's related to education in any way understands that this is like a reckoning time for educators. Like everybody has to have an answer for AI in some way, whether you're answering for how your students are going to use it outside of school, or whether you're answering for how you yourself as an educator are going to use it, or any other number of questions that might come up. It's clear that everyone sees the writing on the wall, in the sense that like we have to figure out what this means for us. And I think schools, educators are no different. They understand that. And so one of the things that I feel really strongly about, there's a famous educational, I call him like an educational writer and theorist named Harold Bloom, who predicted that someday with computer technology, we'd be able to equip each child with their own personal Plato, their own personal philosopher who was brilliant and could help instruct and tutor them in ways that were very personalized to them. And each person would have this Plato in their pocket, as it were. And I think that we're closer to that than we've ever been, in the sense that I tell my kids, I say, I believe, and I hope that by the time you go to college, You'll each have access to a personal AI assistant that will help you learn any subject, help and understand you well enough to know how to teach you that specific subject. You know, and how you learn what your strengths and weaknesses are. I think that type of technology assisted education is what's coming in a real profound way for education across the board, right? It's not limited to schools as they exist right now or private public schools. It's for everybody, and it's all going to be how it's packaged and how it's available, and hopefully we can create it in a way that it's accessible and available to anybody who wants it. So for me, that's one of the big things that I see coming for education is we've long known that computers, the internet, were vehicles to help students get access to knowledge and help learn in ways that were impossible for our parents or our grandparents perhaps. But you know, AI just gives an accelerant to that process and provides a whole new wrinkle to it where we can each ask the question, what would you do if you had a super intelligent tutor that was always at your side? You know, so that's exciting for me.
What a great metaphor, especially like the Play-Doh in your pocket, because Play-Doh via Aristotle creates more, hopefully can create more Alexander the Greats in our life. Uh,
Yeah.
that's a really cool analogy. I like that a lot. I really appreciate you coming on. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences. It's just very rare that somebody can kind of combine that tech talent to tech teaching and tech startups kind of all in one, and it's been just a great conversation. So thank you so much for coming on, Cahlan. It certainly means a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. It was great to meet you, Jeff, and best of luck with everything.